The HeadAmp GSX Mini. This is a 4.5 watts at 32 ohms, full Class A, fully balanced headphone amp designed by Kevin Gilmore. If you don't know who Kevin Gilmore is, he's done a huge amount for the DIY audio community because he just releases designs all the time for free to the public. So good on Kevin Gilmore. One of the designs that he released is called the Dynalo, and that's very similar to this. As far as I'm aware, there are some slight differences because this has more power, but it's otherwise very, very similar. It's got a big brother called the GSX Mark II, or the Dyna-He for the DIY version, but this is their production model. You can buy it for $1,800 from their website, headamp.com, or $2,000 if you want a stepped attenuator instead of a pot. Don't get the stepped attenuator, and the reason I say that is because those steps are 3 decibels each, meaning that's too quiet, that's too loud, that's too quiet, that's too loud. It's just not enough granularity. Would strongly recommend going for the pot version. The actual build quality is fantastic. You can choose what finish and color you get the fascia plate in, so glossy or matte and any color you like. Nice tactile sort of aircraft switch type things, single-ended and balanced outputs. On the top, it is a powder-coated and very open sort of finish with more vents on the bottom as well. Why is it so open? Well, it's because, as I said, this is full Class A, and it gets hot. It needs to dissipate a lot of heat. The top of the unit, when I measured it with the IR thermometer, gets to about 50 degrees Celsius. So don't plan on stacking stuff on top of this. It gets hot. The back is fairly standard I/O. Got balanced and single-ended inputs, and then it's a preamp as well, so balanced and single-ended outputs. And you can switch the preamp outputs off. They are not just on all the time. So there's just a preamp on, preamp off, and you can also use 2 different inputs as well. Let's talk about how it sounds. Before we talk about sound, let's talk a little bit about power, because this is considered by many to be an endgame amplifier. And by endgame, I don't mean that this is the best amp in the world or the most expensive amp in the world, because it's not, and there are better amps than this. But what I mean is that for a lot of regular people who don't have, hundreds of thousands to spend, this is a comfortable end of the upgrade path. $1,800 is an amount which a lot of people in a lot of different jobs can save up for and buy. And so people will work their way up, get this, settle for it, that's it. They don't feel the need to go further. This is end game for a lot of regular people. And because of that, you'd expect that this will also be able to then drive just about any headphone which a lot of people are reasonably likely to have. And I'm bringing it up because it doesn't quite do that. Now, I've tried the GSX Mini with a lot of different headphones and quite a few different IEMs actually, and for most stuff, it's absolutely fine. The Arias are great, the HD100S is great, the Focal Alex is great, the 1266 is a great pairing as well, but the extremes are not so great. Most IEMs are absolutely fine, even if you've not got too much volume control, but really sensitive stuff, there is just a little bit of hiss, just a tiny bit. So if that bothers you, might not be the best option. You might want to get a DAP or a dedicated IEM amp with really low noise like an SA1 instead. And the other end is stuff like the Sesvara. Now, it does the 1266 fine, but if you're an HE6 or a Sesvara owner, it's not quite going to do it. They come across a little bit too soft, not quite enough control. It just didn't... It sounds okay, but it just doesn't sound anywhere near as good as I've heard them on various speaker amps, or the Ferrum Or. That was quite an interesting one, actually. It's okay here. But if you are a Sesvara owner and that's your main headphone and this is going to be your main amp, I would look for something else. Anything else, though, Arias, 1266, Focals, whatever, this will drive them fine. So in terms of setup, I've been using this with actually a few different DACs. Right now I'm using the Gustard X26 Pro. I've got some isolators here, not for isolation, but just to space these out, because both of these run fairly toasty. I've got some AudioQuest Mackenzie XLR interconnects into the amp itself. And then right now I'm using the Arias, but as I've said, I'm using it with a lot of different headphones. Just Arias are quite comfortable when I'm actually filming the review. A quick description then of the sound signature of the GSX Mini. This is an invitingly warm, slightly lush sounding kind of amp with emphasized and sparkly treble. It's a pretty interesting experience because it gives you that warmth and smoothness almost of a lot of other amps like the Schiit Asgard 3, for example, and a little bit of the intimacy as well. Mid-range is a little bit more intimate than it is on other amps, but then the treble almost just has a little bit of added energy to it, a little bit of added space as well. So even though vocals might be slightly closer into you, the actual sort of spatial cues and reverberations of bigger recordings are still really, really good. Macrodynamics are ever so slightly blunted in a way which doesn't make it sound soft. It's not a soft sounding amplifier, but it just calms certain things down. And that's a really nice pairing with stuff like the 1266, which is just full of energy. These are headphones on Red Bull, and this just kind of sweetens the edges a little bit. It's a really nice pairing with those headphones. With stuff like a Verite Closed, which is a very warm sounding headphone, it also has enough sort of treble emphasis to not make it sound veiled, mushy, or lacking. It's a really interesting and I would say tasteful tuning, because even though it's not neutral, and it's not deviating too far from that, it's keeping a signature which works with just about every headphone I've tried. The resolution of the GS6 Mini is an interesting one, because it's very good, but it's not overstated. It's not shouting and screaming about it. There are some other, even lower cost amps, I'd say, that do out-resolve it, but don't keep up with it in overall engagement, and I would say that this is still a better sounding amp. The SA1, for example, that's a really good amp. I like that one a lot, and it does slightly out-resolve the GS6 Mini, but it's also quite a bit sort of smoother and almost flatter sounding. This has a lot more body, a lot more texture, and upper treble stage is quite a bit better on this as well. So the first track that I'm going to use to show a lot of what this amp is about is Saturday by 21 Pilots. The first thing is the vocals. Now the vocals on this are quite processed, but it shows off the resolving capabilities of this amplifier. But the other interesting thing is the fact that on this amp the vocalist sounds somewhat closer to you, even though the actual reverb of the voice isn't affected and in fact sounds very big. Bigger than some other amps like an SA1. That's kind of interesting because it's almost as if you had someone singing a few feet in front of you. This doesn't make everything sound closer. It's as if you took a step closer to the vocalist, but the rest of the recording environment didn't change. The room that things are happening in isn't changing. You're just a little bit closer to the source. That's kind of interesting because it makes vocals more present. You get a lot more of a full sounding effect, but you don't lose any sense of space, of air, and resolution in doing so.
Lose my sense of time or 2 weeks feel like days, Medicaid in the afternoon, and I just want to know, have you lost your footing too?
The second thing is the organ that's playing. That organ, if I were to switch to an SA1, for example, does not sound anywhere near as, well, full, engaging and textured. The actual timbre of the organ is slightly drier, almost, on an SA1, and slightly smoothed over.
I just pray that I'm not losing you. Catch me floating circles in my fishbowl.
It's still good. This is still an excellent amplifier, but what you're getting when you pay a little bit more is just a little bit more life in that music.
Keep things fresh. She said that I should change my clothes.
That's the best thing about this amp, is the fact that it just warms things up without ever being thick. And even if you have a warm set of headphones like a Verite Closed, it doesn't make them sound mushy or veiled because the added sort of treble energy and retention of air and upper treble extension is really, really good. One thing that I probably should bring up is that some people say that they've found this amp to be slightly sharp. Now, this amp's been around a while, and so I've seen this mentioned on a few forum threads, even some friends have mentioned it. Some people seem to have that issue to an extent where they don't like the amp. Some people just don't have it at all. I don't have it at all. I don't know if that's a US versus UK voltage thing, if it's a unit variance thing, or if it's just someone being used to a warmer signature. You know, this sounds sharper, for example, than a shit Asgard 3. It sounds sharper than an IHA 6. Doesn't sound as sharp as an A90, a 789, or a Ferrum Ore. So I think a lot of it could just be what your reference for a normal sound is. But at the same time, it's something that I did want to mention because it does have a little bit of added treble energy. And some of it might just be synergy with your headphones. If you're using Bayer Dynamics, maybe that is going to be too much. But even on like HD800S, I didn't have a problem. So I did want to mention that, but I've not actually had an issue with it. This amplifier handles separation in a kind of interesting way, because treble elements, plucks of strings, cymbals, that kind of stuff is really, really distinct. Low-end stuff is really separated as well. Different drums. You can listen to the drum solo in Contact by Daft Punk. It's fantastic. but mid-range stuff just blends together a little bit more than I would perhaps like. Not to any kind of bothersome extent. It's not the sort of thing which you listen to and you go, oh, I can't hear what's going on. It still sounds great. It's just if you're A-Bing between this and an SE1 or this and an AHP2 or whatever, it is noticeable. And so you listen to something like Trains by Porcupine Tree, and at this sort of quieter bit, the strings are really distinct and separate. And then when it gets busier, the plucks of the strings and the percussion that's going on is really distinct and separate. But the actual decay of the strings and the vocalist kind of blend together a little bit. As does the guitar, slightly actually. The guitar, it sounds rich and full-bodied, but it's not quite as separate as it could be. It does feel like it's sort of slightly too far back almost, slightly lost in amongst the busyness of this track. If I skip to where the actual vocals are. So yeah, as I said, the percussion and the actual initial pluck of the string is great, and you can hear that super clearly. But the vocalist, the kind of deeper guitar, and the actual decay of the strings is not quite as good as I'd like. So separation is a bit of a mixed bag. Percussion is distinct, but vocals and mid-range elements just sometimes are a little bit too congested. So what does this mean for classical music then? Because even if you can hear the violins and the really high-end stuff and the drums all the way down low, what if you can't hear the horns and the brass and the woodwind? Does that take away from the experience? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag there, because classical sounds fantastic on this. I really, really enjoy listening to it, but for slightly different reasons than I do on other amps. Other amplifiers will separate and pull things out a little bit more. But if you were actually there when something was recorded, you wouldn't be able to hear that. I've spent a lot of time listening to classical and orchestral music in real life, and you can't hear each individual instrument. That's not how it works. There are some venues which are much better than others, but no matter what, you can't hear each and every individual element perfectly. That is something you only get when it is a very refined, sort of artificial, to be honest, recording with microphones everywhere, post-processed, and played back on a really good system. You can't hear it if you're actually sat in the audience. This is giving me an experience closer to if I was actually sat in the audience, because the stuff that in most venues would be more apparent is more apparent, and the stuff that is slightly more subdued is slightly more subdued. And that's why I really like this for classical, because it's a different experience to a lot of other amps. It's closer to reality, even though it's not actually doing some stuff as well. It's a bit counterintuitive, but something like this, Final Ascent by Hans Zimmer from the No Time to Die soundtrack, sounds beautiful. That's a fantastic piece of music, by the way. Also, that film's really good. Go see that if you haven't already. Classical music on this is brilliant, but it's a different experience to what you'll get on a lot of other amps. I really, really like it, but you do want to know what you're getting into. This is not as technically capable in the mid-range specifically, but because of that, it's also more forgiving. It's also in some ways more realistic, and it's a really, really enjoyable, inviting experience that you can just sit and listen to for hours. This is an amp which keeps enough resolution and energy in the treble to avoid at all sounding veiled or mushy, but adds enough warmth, body, and just lets enough stuff go that you can put anything on and it will sound fantastic. So there are certain genres and tracks like orchestral music which are slightly different on this amplifier, but not necessarily any better or worse. It's just a different experience, and I would happily have this as a main amplifier. It's not necessarily what I'd say a reference signature, but it's absolutely capable of doing whatever you want to throw at it. There are certain genres which sound brilliant on this. Now, this is You Shook Me All Night Long by AC/DC. On some amps, this can sound just a little bit too dry. This is kind of mastered, to be honest, for slightly warmer sounding setups. And this is a slightly warmer sounding setup. And it works on this. It just takes the edge off the sharper bits without losing it or hiding any resolution. The lower end is just full and weighty and impactful. The drums sound brilliant. This track just works on this amp. It's got a real jam out kind of feel. There's not really much I can say other than this sounds fantastic on this amp, and I'd much rather listen to this track on the GS6 Mini than probably anything else I've got on the desk at the moment. Maybe not the WAV-33, it would sound good on that. But it sounds fantastic on this. What about stuff that doesn't work so well? There are two things which this amp struggles with slightly, which can make music not do so well. Most music sounds fantastic on this, even if it is different from a reference signature. But there are a couple tracks which you go, it's not really handling this too well. Now, the first issue is the previously mentioned mid-range separation. It's not great with that. Everything in the low end and the treble is brilliant, but just the mid-range and upper low end, it does struggle a bit. And so when you've got a track like this, which is All of the Time by Jungle, which is very mid-bass and mid-range heavy, things do just sound a little bit congested. Everything's just slightly too close, slightly too blended together. It just doesn't sound all that resolving on this track, even though I know it has the resolving capabilities to handle other stuff. It's just that this track is kind of throwing a lot of the stuff which this amp isn't particularly good at all at once, and so it's not sounding great. Because when those bells in the distance come in, then you go, oh, it can do that. It can do the stage. It can do the resolution. Like, those bells sound really distant, but everything else is too close. So the stage is somewhat variable depending on where in the frequency spectrum it is, which is a little bit annoying. And the second issue is that some electronic type music doesn't necessarily work too well on this. Because whilst the actual timbre, not just in terms of being warm, but actual accurate timbre of low end is really good, the resolution and definition, the separation of it and layering, positioning even, that's all really good, but the actual crack, initial impact of things is slightly muted, slightly blunted. Macro dynamics are just softened a touch. It's not a soft sounding amp, but again, when comparing to other stuff, you can feel that it's just taken the edge off. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you do want things to just have the edge taken off, as it gives a really inviting, lush, enjoyable experience that you can listen to for hours and never get fatigued. But sometimes you want to be slapped around the back of the head with super fast, super impactful bass, and this doesn't quite let you have it. And so Woman by Elderbrook kind of shows this. There's a synth in the treble and upper mid-range which sounds fantastic. The vocals, the vocals aren't actually particularly well produced, I guess, on this track, so it's not much to say there. But the initial impact of the low end and the kick is not quite as forceful as it should be.
Been a fool, I've been a fool.
Because if I switch to, I haven't got the HP2 at the moment on, so let's do the SA1. The vocals sound better here. Most of the other stuff going on in this track sounds better on the GS6 Mini, but the actual kick, which is the predominant element in this particular part of this mix, sounds better on there because it's more impactful, it's faster. It just feels like the edges have been slightly taken off in a way which, for a lot of music, is going to work well, but for electronic, doesn't necessarily do what you want it to do. I think the two things that I love about this amp the most are, well, firstly, the fact that it's a warmer amp without the same drawbacks as a lot of other warmer amps. A lot of warmer amps, they'll sound thicker, denser, not as spacious, often not as outright resolving either. You have to give up on resolution and size of stage in order to get that body and mid-range warmth. Whereas here, you're not doing that. It's still a very big sounding amp, even if the soundstage isn't perfect because of the mid-range issue. It's still big. It's still really quite expansive because the upper treble air retention is great. And the second thing I really like is the fact that the tuning of this just seems to work with basically every headphone I've tried. And I can't say that about many amps. The HB2 is overall my favorite headphone amp, which I'm going to be doing a video on that because even though it's a speaker amp, it's got some really interesting characteristics which make it great as a headphone amp. That's my favorite overall, but it's not perfect for every headphone. Verite Closed, for example, just didn't sound right on that, and I much preferred it on both the Dynalo and the tube amp that was there. They just seem to like a lot warmer of a signature. Some really warm amps don't do well with things like an Aria, for example. I don't like these on warm-sounding amps, but I like it on this. I've not found anything that I didn't think worked on this. The only headphone that didn't work was the Zavara, and that was just a power thing, not a sound signature thing. And even then, it still sounds fine. It doesn't sound bad, it's just not as good as some other stuff. I like the fact that this gives you a really tasteful tuning which works with so many headphones and doesn't give you the same drawbacks as a lot of other warmer sounding amps. So overall then, I really like this amp. I really like the GSX Mini and I think it's got a lot going for it. At this price point, it's fantastic. It's not a perfect amp for everyone because it's not a fully neutral amp, and well, hell, some people aren't going to want a fully neutral amp, but because it is a tasteful deviation from neutral without going too far, there are some things it doesn't quite work with. But most music sounds a lot better on this than it does on an SA1. Some stuff like electronic, I would prefer something a little bit faster, even if it does mean it's a drier or more clinical amp. But most acoustic stuff, rock, orchestral, a lot of pop music even, indie stuff, is brilliant on this. The added warmth it gives to just about anything without ever going too far, even if you have warm cans, and the retention of air, resolution, detail, and slight emphasis on the treble. It's a really, really enjoyable signature. I like this amp a lot, and it's got a full recommendation from me. The only thing I'd say is if you're a strictly electronic fan, then it might not be the best. But for just about anyone else, it's brilliant. If you'd like to talk to me or any other Wiggly Air enthusiasts, then join the Discord server at the link in the description, or support me on Patreon or Subscribestar and get access to the private Telegram chat. Thank you so much to every single one of you who is supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar. You guys are fantastic. Especially my Crazy Summit 5 people, Chief Big Time, Erroneous, Dan Mellinger, Fake Aussie Accent, Joe, King Jung-un, Commodus, Ross Kyle, and Disaster. My Legend tier supporters, Chandler Bassett, Chris, CK Yozizawa Zoo, Jithan the Shiba, and Gravitas, and my Diamond supporters, Adam Cardos, Beanbo Owito, Beefy Fish, Bob Butler, Not Twist, Clockmeister, Desert Scrub, Dwayne Butler, Gizmo1K, Grant Evans, Jean R, Luxifer, Nino, and Pokey. Thank you guys so much. You make this all happen.